Hi, Acadiana. I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker. Happy Monday to you. It's October the 21st. This is Let's Talk Tropics here on Acadiana Weather Today. Ended up with kind of a busier weekend than planned. We ended up with two named storms. We left you on Friday. We thought one was going to have a chance before it made its way onshore in Central America. That was Nadine, and it did so. And then we had Oscar, which is still with us today, but Oscar, a tiny little storm, ramping its way up to hurricane strength. And we kind of talked about that a little bit on Friday as well, how sometimes these very, very small systems can whip up into something strong in a very short period of time. Of course, we saw that with Milton just about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago or so. It was a very tiny storm and then whipped all the way up to a Category 5. Now, fortunately, Oscar did not make it up to anything super strong. I think the winds topped out at 85 miles per hour. But some of the things that I was reading in the discussions over the course of the weekend is, thank goodness we have hurricane reconnaissance aircraft to go in there, because you do these satellite scans and sometimes you get a pretty good idea of what's going on. And if you've got somebody on the ground that can take the measurements too, you've got those. But in this particular case, some of the satellite scans that were going on over the weekend were showing that the winds inside of Oscar were maybe 45, 50, maybe up to 60 knots. But of course, once the recon went out there, they found a bona fide hurricane. Well, it's not a hurricane anymore. Winds are down to 40 miles per hour, and it's visiting eastern Cuba right now in a very mountainous region. So we think it's probably going to be weakening even further before it gets picked up by a trough and pulled back out toward the northeast. So we'll talk about Oscar and other things that might be out there, not just this week, but coming up for the following week as we start to get into November. First of all, another beautiful day here in Acadiana. It's going to be on the warm side, though. Temperatures should climb up to about 60, or rather about 86 degrees later this afternoon, and then fall back into the 50s a little bit later on tonight. But we are going to be seeing just lots of sunshine here for the next several days. Temperatures are going to be above normal. We should be hovering in the upper 70s this time of the year, with our nighttime lows dipping down closer to 50 degrees. But you can see a very, very pretty day once again here in Acadiana, with plenty of sunshine and dry conditions and really not much of any cloud cover. But I think there will be a few clouds starting to pick up a little bit later on this afternoon as a little bit more moisture tries to reach its way back into the region. A couple of things on the national picture. We've got a big ridge of high pressure that's out here over the eastern half of the country, and a low that's kind of moving out of the Four Corner states that's going to go ahead and cruise its way off toward the Great Lakes. So we might get a little bit more of a return flow that could bring some extra moisture in place. Unfortunately, it is not going to be bringing any rainfall, and we haven't had any rainfall since September the 24th. And I don't think we're going to see any rainfall for at least the next 7 days. And to tell you the truth, it looks like October might end up staying relatively dry. There's a little rain that's showing up in some of the models here coming up at the very end of the month. But even if we finish off with a trace of rain for this October, which is all we received so far, which was back on October the 1st, that still would not be the driest October ever. We've had a couple of months where we received no rainfall during the month of October. So October can kind of go back and forth. It can be a very wet month. On average, it is one of our wetter months. But as we look at recent history, October always seems to be somewhat drier. So we are still in a dry period, and we're probably going to stay there for the remainder of the week. So here's a look at the wave height and direction in the Gulf of Mexico. Things are still a little on the rough side, but I do think the winds and seas are going to start to calm down a little bit as we get more of a southerly flow for the second half of the week. But fair conditions across the Gulf of Mexico. No issues out there for today. Everything is pretty much down to our south. What was left of Nadine has now worked its way off into the Pacific Ocean, so the heavier rains that were over Central America over the weekend with Tropical Storm Nadine have now subsided, that making landfall over Belize. And then on the Caribbean satellite, of course, you can see hurricane, or what is now Tropical Storm Oscar there, kind of spinning over the eastern part of Cuba. And it's eventually going to be picked up by a trough and pulled off toward the northeast. Now, most of the models were on target for having this drift off toward the west, stall near Cuba, and then kind of kick off toward the northeast, but none of the models really had anything indicating that this was going to fire up into a Category 1 hurricane as quickly as it did over the weekend. So right now we're just looking at a tropical storm which more likely will become a tropical depression a little bit later on. Eastern parts of Cuba have some pretty mountainous terrain, and there are some mountain peaks that get close to 4,000 feet. So when you get a tropical system coming in at sea level, especially something that small, it can get torn apart fairly quickly. And the rest of the Atlantic basin is relatively quiet, so other than Oscar, the National Hurricane Center not expecting any extra development here for the next 7 days, which is good news. And we're going to see this a lot more common now as we start to push into the month of November. So here is the latest satellite imagery of Oscar. Again, the center of circulation is very hard to pick up. It's right there over the eastern tip of Cuba. Again, kind of a mountainous area down toward Guantanamo Bay on the southern side of that eastern part of Cuba. It's relatively flat, but between there and the western part of the Atlantic, as you go into the Bahamas there, that eastern edge of Cuba has some pretty good mountainous terrain though. So Oscar quickly getting ripped apart by the terrain there. There's the current position in the forecast track as well, as it is going to continue to move off toward the northeast. Models are really consistent. Bermuda might have to watch out for a quick blow from this one as it moves off toward the northeast, but at this point, because it's going to be picked up by a pretty significant trough, it appears there's going to be a significant amount of wind shear in place. So most of the models are holding this as a tropical depression or a low-end tropical storm. Looks like one model trying to bring it back up to a Cat 1 hurricane, maybe going out to day 4.5 to 5 or so. But for the most part, we think that Oscar is going to stay a tropical depression or a tropical storm over the rest of its life. So as we look at the HWRF model, we've got a couple of hurricane models that are working with this, and this doesn't really get very strong. I think the maximum winds on the HWRF maybe go up to about 60 knots, so it doesn't quite make it back to hurricane force, and then it will be a non-tropical system probably after day 3 or so. And the HAFS model is very similar. Again, the wind speeds don't get much more than maybe 45 or 50 knots when it moves off to the northeast, but by the time it reaches those higher wind speeds of 50 or 60 knots, by that point it's what's called an extratropical low pressure center as it moves off toward the northeast. There is the GFS model for the next 10 days, and you see Oscar quickly lifting off to the northeast. But watch these last few frames over the Western Caribbean. You get another low that starts to develop there around Halloween, and we might be talking about the possibility of a hurricane. Now, this is the latest model. And if there are usually tropical storms or hurricanes this time of the year, a lot of times they develop in the western part of the Caribbean and then push off toward the northeast. So the folks that are down in Cuba, Haiti, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico really can't let their guard down during the month of November like we can a little bit easier here along the northern Gulf Coast. I don't know if you knew this, but no hurricanes have ever hit Louisiana during the month of November. But we've had a couple of hurricanes at the very, very end of October. We had Hurricane Zeta back in 2020 that reached land as a Category 3. I think it made landfall in Cocodrie on October the 28th. And then farther back, we had Hurricane Juan that came into Vermilion Bay back in 1985 as a Category 1 hurricane, that also making landfall on October the 28th. So we don't like to quite let our guard down completely here along the northern Gulf Coast until we get into the early part of November. So as far as the Euro model, we are seeing Oscar kind of cruise its way off toward the northeast. The Euro model starts to get a bit of a low pressure area to develop here going into the latter part of October and the early part of November, but it doesn't look quite as defined as what the GFS model is showing. But it is showing a concentration of moisture here over the western part of the Caribbean going into the first few months of October. And the Canadian model also shows Oscar making a cruise off toward the northeast and getting out of the way, but you do see a bit of a low pressure area trying to develop here as we get into Halloween and the first few days of November. You can see that low there. It's starting over here, so you see Oscar again kind of lifting away. And then you watch a bit of a low pressure area kind of trying to develop here in the western part of the Caribbean Sea. There it is there, and then it starts to pull a little bit farther toward the northeast. So again, Jamaica, Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic would need to watch out for something like this. And the icon is also showing some deepening low pressure areas over the western part of the Caribbean as well. Although the icon model doesn't quite go out as far, you do start to see the pressures lowering there off of the Colombian coastline and then starting to drift out into the western part of the Caribbean Sea. So I do have 4 models that are kind of in agreement, not only that Oscar's going to take the track that's expected by the National Hurricane Center, but also that going into the early part of next week, we might be seeing the possibility of some new tropical activity developing. Now, fortunately for us, here in the U.S., there's going to be a huge ridge of high pressure and a lot of wind shear that's going to be blocking anything from coming in our direction. So right now, I don't have any issues with anything that would be developing during the month of November, because we're going to be seeing these deep low pressure areas kind of drifting across the continental U.S. Those troughs should be able to pick anything up and steer it off toward the northeast. But for our friends that are down in the Caribbean, they would want to watch this, because not only is there going to be relatively low wind shear over the Caribbean Sea over the next several days, but the water temperatures are still extremely warm. We're starting to see some cooling here along the northern Gulf Coast. In fact, we're down below 80 degrees over much of the waters there from about Corpus Christi through the Louisiana coastline and then going on down to Key West. But in the western part of the Caribbean, we're still looking at water temperatures there about 29 to 30 degrees Celsius. So you're still looking about 84 to 86 degrees on the Fahrenheit scale. So that's definitely something that could support tropical activity there over the southwestern Caribbean. And the tropical cyclone heat potential is really starting to drop off now in the Gulf of Mexico as the hurricane season is starting to shut down in the Gulf. But again, those areas over the western part of the Caribbean are still seeing a high end there of the tropical cyclone heat potential. So if you get low wind shear, you've already got the warm water temperatures, you've got high tropical cyclone heat potential. So the possibilities are still there over the western Caribbean over the next several days for the possibility of some new tropical development. And that tropical hazards outlook, we'll get an update on this tomorrow, but I'll be able to give you the first view of it on Wednesday because it comes down later in the afternoon. But last week's that came out was showing the possibility of something going on there. Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, over toward Jamaica, between later this week and going into the early part of next week. But then you look at week 3, which covers October 30th through the first few days of November. And that's that area where some of the computer models are starting to show up with some low pressure developing. So I'm pulling up the GFS model. Now this one just ran, and I took the frames that I had because it wasn't quite finished running. But you can see there that that low pressure area going out beyond 10 days, October 31st through about November the 3rd or 4th there, you have a sizable tropical system that could be pushing northeastward. So Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico even, and maybe even the Virgin Islands farther to the east, and then north of that, the Bahamas, because what's going to happen is there's going to be a trough. Again, if this verifies, there's going to be a bit of a trough that's coming off the east coast of the U.S., so the general movement of this would be kind of in that particular direction, eventually moving out to sea. But the deepness of that, that's going down about 940 millibars, so that is definitely the possibility of a hurricane developing there, moving across Jamaica, and then possibly cruising into Haiti, Cuba, and the western part of the Dominican Republic. Again, we've got a lot of time to watch this, but it just goes to show you that hurricane season isn't quite over yet. And just like we were talking about earlier in the hurricane season, that maybe August was going to be, because it was so quiet, that maybe September was going to be more like August and October was going to be more like September. And I believe if I read somewhere, we've had a record number of named storms from about the 3rd week of October to where we are here in September than where we are here in October. So we've had a large number of storms that have fired up here toward the end of the hurricane season. And because this has been kind of a strange hurricane season, I wouldn't doubt that we would see more activity coming up during the month of November. And November still is a relatively busy month, even though it's considerably lower than what we see here during the early part of September. But as we started to go into November, you still see some activity that's almost as high as what you would see in July and the early part of August. So normally we would have one tropical system developed during the month of November, but if we end up with 2, That's going to take us to 17 named storms over the year. So if we get 2 more, we're already above normal. Again, not quite up to where some of the early season forecasts were, but when you get 15, 16, 17 named storms during a hurricane season, you do end up with that looking like a much busier season than you would normally have. I can tell you when I first started 30 years ago here, when we got to the O name in, and Pablo and Tanya, I think is what we had during the 1995 season, that was almost unheard of. And then, of course, we had 2005, we had 2020, and we've had all of these busy seasons so far. But back then, the normal number of named storms per year was about 10, and now the named storm normal is about 14. So we've already exceeded that, and we'll probably see at least 1 more, according to some of the computer models here, within the next couple of weeks. So hurricane season, again, not quite over yet. But Oscar is probably going to be downgraded to a tropical depression before moving back out near the Bahamas, and then it's got a little chance for strengthening once again. But those winds now down to 40 miles per hour. So that's what I've got for you on this Monday. If you like this video, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and turn on those notifications as well. And also, if you haven't heard the news, starting on November the 4th, I'll be putting my forecast there on Big 102.1, Planet Radio 106.7, and Freedom 95.1. They'll be on the big shows during the morning, also the midday time period and the afternoon drive. You'll be able to hear my forecasts on those great radio stations. And in between any of those broadcasts, don't forget, I'll post any updates that are needed on my social media pages, both on Facebook and X. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. Hope you enjoy the rest of your Monday, and I'll see you for Acadiana weather today, tomorrow morning, Tuesday, October the 22nd. See you then.